Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is one of the things that I really like as an academic, is the chance to actually present my work to people who might actually care about it, or a place where it might have an impact or have some influence. So what we just heard was sort of a kind of big picture outlook on the music or the content industries. Personally, as a sort of an economist, an academic economist, a junior professor at Wellesley College, I don't really feel qualified to have my own big picture outlook. Right now, what I see myself as sort of a scientist who can bring some measurement to some of the issues that we're thinking about. And I think there's room for that in a debate where, on copyright, where many sides sort of speak without facts or figures or numbers, mostly from what seems to almost sometimes be theological bias. I think there's room for people who can actually look at the data and sort of say, hey, this is what the data seem to be telling us about this. So that's what I'm going to try to do today about one particular issue. So I should say up front, I have a couple of co-authors on this paper that has been out there on the internet and that's currently under peer review. Two of them at Carnegie Mellon, and one of them was actually my undergraduate student at Wellesley College. What we decided that we wanted to do is we wanted to evaluate, there was a very, very sort of different, sort of very controversial law that got passed in France called Hadopi. I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with this. And it was sort of a piece of anti-piracy legislation that was passed, and that there was a lot of controversy and a lot of questions about what would happen with this law. And there's a lot of those questions that when we get into it in a moment, I'm going to tell you I'm not qualified to answer. But one or two of them that were some of the biggest questions that were most highly debated was something that I figured, you know what, with some data, I could answer these questions. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. So economists, we love to sort of start our presentations by motivating the issue. In fact, all academics like to do that. It's never hard to motivate a paper about file sharing in the music business, because all you need is a slide like this that points to the same fact that every other economist points out when they do this, which is, in the 10 years since Napster, the size of the music industry has halved. All right? That's motivation for a lot of research. The question that came up a number of years ago was, how much of this contraction of the industry was actually due to file sharing, and how much of it was because of all the other things that have been going on since then? Right? Well, the nice thing is that economists, especially academic economists, we like to spend time to get it right. So we took about 10 years, and over the last 10 years, we've had a number of papers, and we finally decided as economists that when people are out there downloading music for free, they might actually buy a little bit less of it. So good news, economists have decided that yes, file sharing is hurting sales. I say that with a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but as you probably are aware, there's a lot of debate over the internet whether that's even true or whether file sharing may help sales. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that somebody who's a researcher in this area and who's written some of these papers actually, although there are many studies, you can call anything a study. You could take any data, any numbers, and call it a study. There are about maybe 10 or 11 papers, or at least in the econ literature, published in good peer-reviewed journals, and all but one of them essentially, and that one was sort of done with very, very early data back in the early 2000s, all but one of them say that file sharing is hurting sales. And the only question was whether it was responsible for 1/5 of the decline of the music industry or the entire decline of the music industry, right? Somewhere in between, right? So to me, what got interesting, and I worked on that for a little while, but what was interesting to me was, all right, let's accept that this is true. To me, what was interesting is what can we do about this? And I've worked on papers on sort of both sides of the issue. What sort of business strategies might be are out there that are available that can be effective or that wouldn't be effective in dealing with the file sharing phenomenon, right? And then also, something that there's been a dearth in the literature is what sorts of government intervention might actually have an impact on this. And believe it or not, this hasn't been studied very much. So there's a question, what is this law Hadopi, this law that was passed in France? So the translation of Hadopi, it was the creation and internet law, right? The law empowers the Hadopi government to essentially compel the ISPs to allow content owners to monitor traffic of internet users and look for instances of copyright infringement. And this is a graduated response law. It's sometimes referred to colloquially as the 3 strikes law. Because essentially what happens is that content owners, if they find an instance of infringement, can forward that to Hadopi, and then Hadopi will do one of 3 things. If it's the first instance of infringement for that individual, they'll send them an email saying, stop doing this, right? If it's the second instance of infringement, they'll send them a postal mail, and there'll also be some information about, hey, look, if you think somebody's hijacked your internet, you really need to secure your internet because you're responsible for your internet address, right? And finally, if it's the third strike, the third instance of infringement, then there's the possibility of taking this person to court and holding them responsible, one, for a fine, and two, for sort of removing their right to use the internet for a period of up to 1 month. So they can go on an internet blacklist where no internet service provider is allowed to provide them internet. And this third strike, this sanction, is a big part of what made this law very, very controversial. So I wouldn't really say whether any of these points are true or not. What is interesting is that the reasons that this law became controversial, and here are 4 of the big things that got brought up in the media, both by French citizens and then by people around the world who were watching. All right? One point that was made was that the cost of Hadopi, of sort of putting this law in place and then monitoring and keeping it going every year, was thought to be high. All right? So the question was, is it even worth it? All right? The second was the idea that Hadopi may violate the net neutrality principle. I'm not enough of an expert to tell you whether that's true or not. You know, if somebody can monitor your connection just to see if you're guilty of a copyright infringement, does that mean that the internet pipes are no longer dumb? Is net neutrality been violated? You know, I'll leave that to legal scholars. Okay, but that's something that's been brought out as like, oh man, this is really going to constrain the internet. This is the first step in constraining the free flow of information. The third is that Hadopi may actually hold internet users responsible if their connections are hijacked. Right? So there's the possibility that if somebody else is using your connection, that you could be held responsible for that. Whether or not that will happen is a different story, but that came out as one of the big issues in the media, regardless of whether that was really such a, a rallying flag for the opposition to Hadopi. And finally, there's been some media reports out there saying that the UN has declared internet to be a fundamental human right. I tried to investigate this. It's sort of tough to get it right when the media says different media outlets say different things. As far as I can tell, I think it may be the case that one member of the UN may have made a comment to this effect, and suddenly that the UN has now said that the internet's a human right, and therefore Hadopi is, completely unprincipled, right? It's not clear to me that that's exactly what happened. But it was certainly a rallying flag for the opposition to this law. I can't really comment on most of these pieces. But there was one other thing that got brought up on the internet that I thought was interesting that I realized I could do something about. And a lot of people on the internet, certainly a biased sample, were saying, you know what, not only all these things, but this law isn't going to have any effect on file sharing. It's not going to have any effect on sales. Because you know what, I'm going to find my way around the law. Right? I'm going to find ways to pirate. This isn't going to change any consumer's behavior. And by the way, I'm actually so annoyed by this, I'm going to go out and pirate more. You get a lot of that out on the internet as well. Okay? That was something that I thought, as an economist, this is what sort of empirical economists are good at. We're good at testing the causal effect of X on Y, teasing everything out from the correlations, and figuring out the causal effect of X on Y. In this case, my question was, what was the actual effect of this law on sales? Did it have the impact that it was trying to have, or did it not? Now, I got to tell you a little bit about the history of Hadopi, because that turns out to be really, really important here, and we'll see that in a moment. Hadopi was presented, presented to the Senate and passed in 2008, okay? Then the bill was supported and then rejected at the National Assembly in March 2009. So I don't even know exactly legally how this works. Apparently it was supported, but then it was rejected, okay? Then in in May 2009, both the National Assembly and the Senate backed a revised version of Hadopi. So is it in effect or is it not in effect at this point? I'm not sure, and it's not really clear to me that the average French citizen could tell at this point. Because then the opposition took it and sent it to the Constitutional Council saying it was unconstitutional, and the Constitutional Council actually rejected the main portion of the bill. So now I guess it's probably not in effect. Okay? But then the main portion was revised, and in October 2009, the Constitutional Council backs the amended portion, backs this amended bill, and so now I guess you could say it's in effect. But of course, just because a law is in effect doesn't mean that we're necessarily enforcing it yet. It takes a little while to get things up and running. So it wasn't until about a year later that actually the first wave of first-round notices went out. So there's really a question here. If you even expect this law to have an effect, when do you expect it to have an effect? It's not clear to me, as somebody who's researched this a lot, exactly when it was effective and when it wasn't. So it's really not necessarily going to be clear to a French citizen reading about this in the news. So one of the challenges in the data, besides trying to tease out the whole causal effect of the law, is to figure out, well, when would I even expect to see an effect of this law? And that's one of the things that I had to deal with. So here's the main question. The main question was, what is the effect of Hadopi on French music sales? You could ask this about other content industries as well, but for me, I was interested in music sales. All right? Number one reason that this question is hard is that we observe the red line here. That's the French sales pattern over time. So we observe French sales over time. Okay? That's the only world we live in, the world where Hadopi was passed and we can observe sales before and after Hadopi. But sales are changing over time for a lot of reasons. In fact, I'm going to end up looking mostly at digital sales, and we know that the digital market is a growing market. So if all you do is put out numbers about the growth in sales, it's very easy to say, hey, there's 100 other reasons for that. What you really want to do is you also want to observe this dashed blue line, a hypothetical. Economists like to call this the counterfactual. You want to observe what would French sales have looked like in a world where Hadopi had not been passed. Because if you can observe the blue line and the red line, then the gap between the two is the actual effect of the law, the causal effect of the law on sales. Fortunately, this is sort of the forte of empirical economists, is in simulating these kinds of counterfactuals in what I hope you'll agree are believable methods. So the methodology we used in sort of jargon, economics jargon, is called a difference in difference model. But what we really mean by this is essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at French sales, and I'm also going to look at a group of control countries. All right? What I'm going to try to do is find a group of countries where, on average, their sale, in a pre-Hadopi world, before Hadopi was even considered, where their sales basically tend to map the same trends over time as France. And fortunately, I had data on about 30 different countries' sales, so I'm going to be able to hunt for sort of a group of countries that seem to be similar enough that when you look at their sales, they're sort of statistically indistinguishable from France in terms of their movement over time. All right? Because if I can do that, then you might believe that, hey, in the absence of Hadopi, France would have continued to move just like this. Hey, if they did it for 52 or 70 weeks over time, you might think they should have done it for the next 10 or 20 weeks as well, except that Hadopi was passed. And that's how I'm going to try to measure. So the red line will observe, but that dashed blue line, I'll try to measure it, and I'll try to give you evidence that I can find a group of countries that really estimates what that dashed blue line should have looked like, French sales in the absence of Hadopi. And then I'm going to do a couple of other things, including just to sort of for a robustness or to sort of help make this more believable, I'm going to do some extra analysis based on genre that I hope will make this a more believable result. So the data I had panel data on weekly iTunes unit sales. I had both track units and album units. The main reason we looked at iTunes, one, it's sort of an established platform that was present in all of these countries. Right? It wasn't really as much of a growth market as, say, something like streaming, which some streaming services weren't even available until after Hadopi, right? So these are sort of an established platform. Two, the digital data tend to be better than physical sales data, so they're more sort of trustworthy, you can trust them a little bit better. And three, there's a lot of literature out there that seems to suggest that these days that consumers are tied to a channel, digital or physical. So you might think that a pirate, somebody who's out there pirating music, if by some chance this law is going to make them stop pirating, they're more likely to turn to iTunes or a streaming service than they are to turn to going to buy CDs again. Okay? But what that means is that in this paper isn't really like what's the overall benefit of Hadopi to the media industries. In fact, this paper is very likely to understate that. The real question here is, what was the effect of Hadopi on one type of media, music, in one single sales channel, iTunes? This is more a paper about, can this law have an effect on consumer behavior? And if so, here's the lower bound estimate, right? But we have to assume that if you find anything here, that there's also the possibility that it would affect streaming services, that would affect movies, that it would affect television, right? This is sort of an early study trying to see, does this law have any effect? Now, the other piece of data that I had, I told you that awareness of the law might actually kind of matter here. What do French citizens, when are they aware of it? When do they think that this thing was passed? Well, I can measure that because what Google Trends, if you know anything about Google Trends, you can type in any search term, and Google Trends will tell you in any country how many people were searching for that every week, all right? Not only that, they'll also tell you all the media mentions of that in any week if you want that as well. So essentially what I can do is I can figure out when did French awareness of this law spike? When did people start to become aware of this law, and when did people start to become aware of the fact that, hey, it might be in play? Okay, so I'm going to use that as sort of, think of it as like sort of the salience or the awareness of the law in France. Here are some descriptive stats. So these are the countries that I use as the control countries. So you've got France as the treatment country. The control countries that I ended up finding provided the very best fit for France were Belgium, Germany, Spain, Italy, and the UK. Not a total surprise. I mean, certainly these are different markets, but you can also imagine why these might be sort of similar sort of similar sales trends over time to France. You can see they're very different sized markets, so I'm not going to look at absolute sales levels. I'm going to look at percentage changes over time. If there's a shock to the global market, it's going to hit the UK much more than it's going to hit France because the UK is bigger. But it may hit them both on the same, sort of the same in a percentage basis. This is just to show you that there's a little bit of math behind the model. This isn't so much any trickery or anything like that. This is really a very, very basic way that economists use to display the data. All this does is this allows me to sort of normalize everything so that you're looking at percentage changes over time, not absolute changes, and things like that, all right? And if you read the paper and if you really like math, there's all sorts of equations like this in the paper. Fortunately, I'm here to distill this for you so you don't have to do that. Essentially, what you do is you run this model, and all it does, it doesn't really transform the data very much or anything like that. So this isn't like I'm suddenly turning the data from one thing to another. It just helps you display it visually in a way that will actually make more sense. All right? You could actually, if you just looked at the raw data and you knew what to look for, you could see the same patterns I'm about to show you. And if you take the coefficients that you get out of this and you plot them on a line graph, you find a line graph like this. All right? The left axis is the natural log of iTunes sales. We could talk about why you would actually take the natural log. That's mostly so that you can look at percentage changes over time. I wouldn't worry about that. But what you see is very interesting. So you see for the period between July 2008 and March 2009, you can see that the red line, the French sales trend, and the blue line, average sales trend in the control group, are almost the same. Slight differences. Actually, these differences are statistically insignificant, which basically means that the pre-Hadopi trend between France and the control group are statistically indistinguishable from each other. In other words, this should be believable to you that in the absence of Hadopi, France probably would have continued to follow the same trend as the average of the control group. Okay? But notice what happens is right here, at this time, March 2009 or April 2009, at this exact point, we see the French sales trend seem to rise above the control group. And then it stays above the control group. And what I think is very interesting is if you look, although it is above the control group, you see the same peaks and bottoms anyway. So it still has the same sales trend, except there's this gap between the two lines now that started in March or April 2009. So what you should take of this is this control group looks like a really good control group for France. And two, it's not good at one particular period, March to April 2009, and then it creates a gap during that period of time, which maintains itself for the rest of the data. Now let's ask, is this a meaningful time for Hadopi? Right? Because a lot of things happen with Hadopi over different. There were a couple dates around March, April 2009 that were significant. But if I take the Google Trends data to show you the French citizens' awareness of Hadopi and plot it basically overlay it, you get this picture. So this is maybe one of the most meaningful graphs in the paper. If you look, where you see this gap begin to appear is exactly when you see the first spike, the second spike, and then the third and highest ever spike in awareness of Hadopi. So this is French citizens' awareness of Hadopi. This is the Google Trends Relative Index. We could talk 20 minutes about how you actually interpret that. But the point is, we've got very little awareness of the law. Then we've got a peak, and that's when you see the French sales start to rise. Then we've got another peak, and followed by a third higher peak. And during that time, the French sales are rising above the control group and then stay above it for the rest of the period of time. This is also when all the media articles were coming out. This is when the French became aware of the law and the sanctions involved with it. High period of debate. If you were to go look up things on the internet, right around this period is when you would see all of the debate really starting and all of the French citizens getting really involved. We're talking about, maybe hundreds of thousands of searches moving to suddenly millions of searches, okay? So this is maybe one of the more convincing pictures in there, is that the timing of this difference between France and the control group is exactly when the French are becoming aware of the law. So already, it already paints a pretty compelling story. This is probably an effect of the law. But you can imagine that when you start to talk about something like this, that people immediately want to debunk this because there's a lot of people out there that just, the moment you say that the law is having its intended effect, you're then quoted as saying Hadopi is a good law. I'm not here to say Hadopi is good or bad. I'm here to measure the effect as a scientist who's sort of objective and doesn't really have an opinion, right? So I did some extra work. The first thing you could ask is this just about market, is there something else that coincidentally happened right around this time that happened in France but didn't happen in the other countries, right? And that's the thing that a lot of news outlets out there tried to say when they saw this study go out on the internet, right? Well, the first thing I can tell you is that this is the aggregate sales data for the 4 major music labels, all right? I'm not allowed to display the data for each individual music label, but I have looked at it, and I can tell you that if you look at each individual music label, you'll get the exact same, well, I shouldn't say the exact same, but very, very similar graphs. And of course, the music labels legally can't collude in terms of pricing or marketing activity, so you could look at each label as sort of an independent experiment, at least with respect to marketing activity or pricing. I've seen some of the pricing data. This isn't like suddenly French prices went down or anything like that. Okay? There is sort of a music initiative that a music initiative that starts all the way over here, but of course the effect had already happened back here. All right? So the point is, one, this isn't like a label-specific event. All right? This is common to all of the labels. And then the second thing that people say is, well, you know what, it doesn't matter. Something might have happened at the exact same time in France, and it's just coincidental that you observe this increase. Now, it's a legitimate argument, and we're held to academic standards, so I have to try to at least tease that argument out. So I thought, you know what, we do know a little bit about genres of music. We actually know a little bit about the tendency to pirate different genres of music. So there are a couple papers out there that have already established a precedent on this and have actually shown it, but I also have my own data. And here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that some genre, controlling for popularity, some genres just have higher tendencies towards piracy than others. So for example, if you take a rock song and a rap song, both of which are equally popular in terms of like legal sales, the rap song is on average going to have much higher levels of piracy. People who listen to rap tend to be more likely to pirate. I just know that from the data. On the other hand, if you have jazz, classical, folk music, or actually, interesting, Christian rock, all right, you find that it has very, very low levels of piracy on average. Even if you take a Christian rock song and sort of a non-Christian rock song that are equally popular, or a classical song and a rock song that are equally popular in legal sales, the classical song or the Christian song is going to have lower levels of piracy on average. And so what that means is that we have another test here. If you think about this, if this is really the effect of the law, if that's what you're observing, then you would think that the high piracy genres would have a really big sort of gap, right? It would have a really big increase from the law, and the low piracy genres would have a very small increase from the law. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a slightly different model, and I'm going to measure the size of this gap. Because if you think about it, the average size of this gap is the causal effect of the law. All right? I'm going to measure it for all tracks or all albums, but then I'm going to measure it for each genre and see if it actually conforms to the pattern that I just told you. So these are regression coefficients. This is the kind of stuff that you have to write to get published in an econ journal. So I'll interpret this for you. This first line here is sort of the change in the control group over time. So that's not so much interesting. Okay? But this second line here, these things that aren't in the stuff in parentheses are standard errors, but these things right here, this is measuring the average size of the gap between France and the control group after Hadopi. So this is measuring the causal effect of the law on sales, tracks and albums. What this says here is that track sales were about 22% higher as a result of Hadopi, and that album sales were about 25% higher as a result of Hadopi. Those are big numbers, by the way, given that we're talking about a period of time when no third notices had actually gone out yet. All right? That's the size of the gap. Now, if we want to test whether this was really the result of the law or not, one thing we can do is ask this genre question. So I ran the same model, but I looked at it for each different type of genre in terms of low piracy or high piracy genres. And what you find, for the low piracy genres, the increase was only about 8%. For the medium piracy genres, the increase was right about the average. It was about 19%. And for the high piracy genres, rap and hip hop, the increase, if you exponentiate this, it was about 30%. So the pattern across genres in terms of the effect of Hadopi was exactly what you would expect if the effect of Hadopi was to stop some people from file sharing and convert them to legal purchases, right? So now if you want to say that, hey, this is not the effect of the law, which a lot of people on the internet still want to say, I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, you'd have to say, okay, something happened. It just happened to happen in March or April 2009. It just happened to happen in France, but not the other countries. And it just happens to be something that not only drives iTunes sales, but drives sales of rap, but doesn't drive sales of jazz, classical, Christian, or folk. Of course, there's still people on the internet trying to say this. So one of the interesting things that happened is that Le Monde, the French national newspaper, put out an article saying, you know, this study, it's all about iPhones. We don't have any data necessarily to support that that was necessarily what happened. We have a couple of graphs about searches for iPhones in France. But we think that to debunk this, all we have to do is show, hey, it could have been something else. We think that in March 2009, the French suddenly started thinking that iPhones were much cooler than they used to. Nobody in the other countries really had that same phenomenon. And by the way, people who buy iPhones tend to like rap music, but don't tend to like jazz, classical, Christian, or folk. That's really the essence of the article that was written. And we thought, you know what? One, okay. But two, you know, it's nice, at least you appealed to a rational argument. I mean, that was interesting, and you tried to get some data. So what we're going to do is get the real data and test that argument. So we said, you know what, let's get iPhone sales data. So here's the Le Monde article. So we actually got penetration of iPhones, iPads, and iPods in France versus the control group. And now it is growing because Apple's a popular company and people like their devices and they're sort of getting a higher penetration rate every year. But if you look, there's really no substance to the claims in Le Monde, right? So this has been, that Le Monde article was highly cited as sort of debunking the study of the American economists, right? But if you actually look at real data, it can't be responsible. The first thing you see is that from 2008 to 2009, the change in penetration of sort of iPhones from France to the control group is about the same, actually. So guess what? The control countries also like iPhones and we're buying a lot of iPhones. Not a surprise. And two, if you look from 2008 to 2010, the increase in the control group was even higher than the increase in France. So this big article about, hey, it's iPhones, I thought that was an interesting idea, worth studying, but the data don't seem to support it. And by the way, there's sort of an interesting anecdote in the paper. If you see, the greatest growth in iPhone penetration was actually in Spain, much larger than the growth in France. If you run our exact same model, but you consider Spain the treatment country, you find that it trends the same as the control group over time, and there's no change whatsoever. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to conclude here. I'm going to try to. Essentially, what we've done here is we've tried to measure the effect of the law, the causal effect of the law. We did some back-of-the-envelope calculations and tried to put a dollar amount on it or a euro amount on it, and we think that that was kind of valuable. But really, at the end of the day, we're not really looking at the total benefit of this law. What we're really asking is, can a law like this affect consumer behavior? And what we think is that the most logical conclusion from all of these findings is, yeah, it really can. I think it's up to people out in the audience, people in different governments to decide, does that make it a good law or a bad law? Or do the benefits outweigh the costs? But certainly the answer here seems to be that yes, when you have a government intervention like this, surrounded by a lot of media awareness and controversy, it can lead to a change in consumer behavior, and a rather meaningful one if you look at the fact that this 25% increase in iTunes sales is before any third wave notices even went up, so before anybody actually lost their internet. Thank you very much.